It started with a flower pot. I know, sounds ridiculous, but that's how these HOA stories always start, right? Something petty. Something harmless. And then boom, it spirals into a mess. My wife, Layla, had just returned from a work trip. She's a quiet, composed woman, professional, organized, and always follows the rules. We'd only moved into the Willowbrook Lake community about 6 months earlier. The neighborhood was beautiful. Manicured lawns, sparkling sidewalks, kids biking around like it was the 90s. And the HOA? Well, they said they were all about community harmony. But harmony had a weird definition here. On Saturday morning, Layla went outside to place a single flower pot near our mailbox. She'd picked it up from a local nursery. Bright red geraniums, her favorite. She just wanted to brighten up the curb. Nothing huge. It wasn't blocking the walkway or violating any rules, or so we thought. About 2 hours later, while we were in the backyard, our doorbell rang. I answered to find a tall, middle-aged man in a golf polo and way too much cologne standing there with a clipboard. Behind him was a woman wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a phone like she was about to film something scandalous. The man introduced himself, Daniel Kent, the HOA vice president. "We're here regarding a violation," he said, like he was about to read us our Miranda rights. Layla came to the door, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at the clipboard and raised an eyebrow. "What violation?" Daniel gestured toward the front yard. "The decorative planter by the curb. That space is community maintained and cannot be modified by homeowners." Layla blinked. "It's not on the community strip. It's beside our mailbox, which is on our property line." The woman with the phone interjected smugly. "We have photos. We measured it." I could see Layla's jaw tighten just slightly. She doesn't like being called out when she knows she's in the right. But she stayed calm. "Look, I've read the guidelines. It's not in violation." Daniel, with a slight smirk, handed her a printed notice. "According to the board, it is. You'll need to remove it within 24 hours or we'll issue a fine." At this point, I was about to speak up, but Layla held up a hand. "I'll contact the HOA directly and resolve it." "Thank you." They walked off, clearly disappointed that she hadn't caused a scene. But here's where it got weird. Later that night, we checked our email. Not only had the HOA sent an official violation notice, but it also accused Layla of lying about placing the flower pot. They claimed that security footage showed an unidentified individual placing the object, implying that it wasn't even a resident who had done it, and that Layla had fabricated the whole situation. I read the email out loud, fuming. "Are they serious? They think you're lying about putting out a flower pot?" Layla was calm, but I knew her well enough to recognize the fire behind her eyes. She pulled out her laptop and drafted a short, direct email back to the HOA board. "I placed the flower pot myself. I live here. This is our property. I am not in violation, and I do not appreciate being accused of dishonesty without any legitimate evidence. If there's any doubt about who I am or my integrity, I'd be happy to clear that up in person. Thank you, Layla Qureshi." The next morning, I watched her march down to the community clubhouse for the HOA open-door meeting. I wanted to go with her, but she insisted on going alone. When she came back 30 minutes later, she looked annoyed, but amused. "So?" I asked. She exhaled and dropped her purse on the table. "You won't believe what happened." Apparently, she walked into the meeting and introduced herself. Danielle and the sunglasses lady, whose name was Karen, I kid you not, were there. As Layla tried to explain that she placed the pot and that their property line clearly included the space beside the mailbox, Karen interrupted, claiming Layla wasn't listed as a legal resident on the HOA records. Daniel backed her up. "We only have a Mohammed Shoaib listed. Are you sure you're not just staying here?" That's when Layla's smile dropped. She opened her wallet, pulled out her federal agency ID, and placed it flat on the table. "Does that make me legitimate enough for your records?" Now, I should clarify, Layla works for a federal investigative agency. Nothing too flashy, but definitely not something the average HOA board wants to mess with. She never flaunts it. She's humble. But when someone questions her identity? Yeah, she doesn't play. Karen apparently turned pale. Daniel stammered. They tried to backtrack, asking for clarification, and claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. I told them I wasn't there to flex my job, Layla said. But I'm also not going to let them gaslight me and question whether I belong in my own house. I gave her a high five. Did they apologize? She smirked. No. But I made them put the violation under review. Over the next couple of days, things got tense in the neighborhood. The HOA didn't formally withdraw the violation, but they also didn't follow up. Meanwhile, neighbors started to talk. Apparently, this wasn't the first time Karen and Daniel had targeted someone new in the neighborhood, especially women who questioned their authority. And Layla? She was done playing nice. What we didn't know yet was that Karen had her own little secret, and we were about to find out just how far she'd go to hold on to her HOA power. For a moment, it seemed like things had cooled off. Layla hadn't received another notice, and the flower pot remained untouched, still blooming bright red beside the mailbox like a tiny symbol of defiance. But this is an HOA we're talking about. If you think silence means peace, you don't know how they operate. 3 days after that meeting, I stepped out to grab the mail and noticed something taped to our mailbox, a bright yellow tag that read, "Unregistered occupant, under investigation." I froze. It wasn't an official notice. It didn't have the HOA letterhead or any signature. But the wording was threatening enough. I pulled it off and stormed inside. Layla! You need to see this. She read the tag once and set it on the counter, her face calm but her fingers twitching with that subtle rage she tries to hide. This wasn't a board-approved action. They're freelancing now. We both knew exactly who was behind it, Karen. She may not have been the president, but she had influence. She always hung around during inspections, poked her nose into every landscaping project, and seemed to think she was the neighborhood's moral compass. Layla sent a complaint to the official HOA inbox, demanding to know who authorized the tag and why it had been placed without documentation or due process. The reply came quickly, but not from the board. It was from Karen's personal email. Dear Ms. Qureshi. As you are not the primary homeowner on file, and your residency has not been officially documented, I took it upon myself to remind you of the community guidelines. If you would like to be formally recognized, please provide 2 forms of ID and a copy of your rental or marriage license. Sincerely, Karen L., HOA Resident Compliance Volunteer *. Layla stared at the screen, stunned. She wants me to prove I'm married to you. That I live here? I was furious. This isn't about a flower pot anymore. This is harassment. We decided it was time to push back, but legally. Layla contacted a housing rights attorney she knew through work. Within a day, we had a formal cease and desist letter drafted and sent to the HOA and to Karen directly. It cited harassment, discrimination, and unauthorized inspection practices. That should have ended it. But Karen? She didn't just double down, she dragged Daniel and the entire board with her. A week later, we received a notice that an emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled, and our property was on the agenda. According to the summary, the board was considering a motion to suspend our HOA privileges, including community access and voting rights, pending residency verification concerns and hostile behavior toward the board. Hostile behavior? Layla laughed when she read that. This is pure retaliation. And they're dumb enough to put it in writing. We decided to attend the meeting, not just to defend ourselves, but to bring everything into the light. We weren't going to let them smear Layla's name behind closed doors. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. When we walked in, the room went quiet. Karen sat at the front beside Daniel, both of them flipping through papers like they were preparing for trial. A few curious neighbors lined the walls, whispering quietly. Most of them looked uncomfortable, unsure of what exactly this was all about. Daniel stood up and addressed the room. We've had several concerning interactions with the residents at Lot 14B regarding violations, false statements about residency, and behavior that could be classified as hostile or threatening. He didn't say Layla's name directly, but everyone knew. Layla raised her hand. I'd like to speak. Daniel hesitated. Karen whispered something to him. He nodded. Go ahead. Briefly. Layla stood up, calm as ever. She pulled a folder from her purse and placed it on the table. Inside is proof of my federal employment, our joint mortgage agreement, my driver's license with this address, and a signed letter from your own HOA administrator confirming my name is listed in the records. What I haven't included, yet, is a formal complaint I've submitted to the State Housing Authority regarding this board's unlawful conduct. Karen turned pale. Layla continued, This isn't about a flower pot. This is about power, and a personal grudge that's been stretched into a campaign of harassment. Daniel stammered. We were simply trying to ensure. No, Layla cut in, raising her voice just enough to silence the room. You tried to discredit me. You accused me of lying. You sent people to intimidate me. And now you're trying to punish us for not backing down. That's abuse of power. And I will take this to court if necessary. The room was dead silent. One neighbor raised a hand. I live across the street. I saw her put the flower pot down herself. This whole thing is ridiculous. Another chimed in. Why does it matter who's on file if they own the house together? And then something unexpected happened. Daniel looked over at Karen. Did you authorize the yellow tag? Karen hesitated. I acted within my volunteer duties. You're not on the compliance committee, he snapped. That's not your role. Layla raised an eyebrow. So this was all Karen? Karen stood up, flustered. We needed to verify. Layla turned to the room. If this board is going to let one person weaponize community policy for their own personal vendettas, then you all need to consider whether you want that kind of leadership. And just like that, the tide began to shift. A neighbor suggested the board delay any action until legal review. Another asked whether Karen's volunteer title gave her any official authority. Within minutes, the meeting unraveled into debate, and Karen was no longer the one controlling the room. We left that night with no decision made, but everything had changed. The pot stayed. The notices stopped. And Karen? Well, her reign was cracking. But Layla wasn't finished. Because in the course of digging up dirt on us, Karen had accidentally exposed something much bigger, a violation of her own. One that could cost her more than just her influence on the board. After that HOA meeting, things were never the same in Willowbrook Lake. Neighbors who once gave polite nods now stopped to chat. A few even apologized to Layla for not speaking up sooner. It was clear that Karen and her inner circle had ruled through quiet intimidation for years, and Layla, by calmly flashing her federal ID and standing her ground, had done what no one else dared, call their bluff. But what Layla uncovered next? That took it from drama to full-on scandal. It started with a tip. A woman named Sandra from 2 streets over knocked on our door one evening. She looked around before she spoke, almost like she was scared someone might see her. I wanted to thank your wife, she said quietly. I was fined last year for putting solar lights in my garden. Said it was a safety hazard. They made me remove them and pay a $250 fine. Layla frowned. That doesn't sound like a real rule. It's not, Sandra whispered. I found out later, Karen made it up. I've tried getting a copy of the enforcement report, but the board says it's sealed. That triggered something in Layla. After Sandra left, she dug through the HOA bylaws and found that every violation issued in the community is supposed to be recorded in an annual compliance ledger, something residents have the right to review by appointment. Layla scheduled a visit. At the HOA office the next morning, a part-time assistant named Brian greeted her. You want to see the compliance ledger? That's a bit unusual. Layla smiled politely. It's in the bylaws. After a bit of fumbling, Brian produced a thick, disorganized binder. Layla flipped through the pages, snapping photos on her phone. What she found was unbelievable. More than a dozen violations were listed under residents' names, but no corresponding photographs, signatures, or inspection notes. Worse, several of the fines collected were listed as paid to community representative, with Karen's initials. That's when Layla knew Karen hadn't just been power tripping, she had been running a little side hustle, exploiting vague rules and forging fines to line her own pockets. Layla immediately emailed the scanned pages to the HOA board, and CC'd the state HOA oversight agency, too. By noon our phone rang. It was Daniel. "I had no idea," he said. "We never cross-verified her enforcement actions. I assumed they were logged correctly." Layla was quiet for a moment. "You let her operate unchecked for years. That's on you." Daniel sighed. "There's going to be an emergency audit. We'll be holding a special meeting. Karen's position is under review." But the fallout didn't stop there. Word spread quickly. Neighbors began to compare stories. Sandra found others who had paid Karen cash or Venmo for violations. A retired couple had been threatened with liens over a mailbox color change. Another man, an Army vet, was fined for flying a small flag outside his garage. All of it traced back to Karen. The community was furious. Karen, however, wasn't going down without a fight. She started showing up at people's homes, claiming Layla had doctored the documents. She tried to call for a new vote to have us evicted from the HOA. She even handed out flyers accusing us of destroying neighborhood harmony. That's when Layla had enough. At the next community meeting, a week after the audit started, Layla walked in carrying a laptop and a projector. Karen was already there, arms crossed, whispering to a couple of loyal neighbors. But most people had turned against her by now. Daniel stood at the front, looking tense. "Before we begin," he said, "Mrs. Qureshi has something she'd like to share." Layla plugged in her laptop and clicked on a folder marked Evidence. "I'm not here to create drama," she said calmly. "I'm here to show the truth." Slide by slide, she went through everything. Photos of the ledger entries. Screenshots of community members' Venmo payments to Karen. A copy of the HOA bylaws with the rule about required documentation. And finally, a letter from the State Housing Enforcement Office, confirming that a formal investigation into Willowbrook Lakes HOA had been opened. The room was silent. Layla paused, then looked directly at Karen. "You called me a liar. You tried to erase my presence. And you used your position to steal from this community." Karen stood up. "This is defamation. She's twisting everything." "No," Daniel interrupted. "She's not." He took a deep breath and turned to the room. An internal audit confirmed discrepancies in the violation records going back over 3 years. Funds were collected without proper invoices. And it all points back to Karen. Karen's face went pale. One neighbor shouted, "So what happens now?" Daniel looked grim. "Effective immediately, Karen's volunteer privileges are revoked. A refund process will be initiated for the wrongful fines. And as of this week, the board is undergoing a full restructuring with third-party oversight." Karen stormed out, but no one followed her. In the weeks that followed, the energy in the neighborhood changed. People smiled more. The board meetings became more transparent. New volunteers stepped up, actual volunteers, not self-appointed tyrants. And the best part? Layla was asked to join the board. She said no. "I didn't do this for power," she told them. "I just wanted to live in peace." Instead, she helped train the new compliance committee, establishing clear guidelines, real documentation policies, and a resident appeals system. The flower pot? Still standing. Still blooming. And as for Karen? We later heard she moved out quietly, sold her house to an out-of-state buyer, and left the neighborhood in the middle of the night. Fitting, really? All it took was one accusation, one ID, and one woman who refused to be erased.